Then let's finalize this market part, but also the whole course microeconomics up to now by talking about the welfare implication for producer and also consumer at the long run equilibrium. Yeah. And we come to the producer surplus first, which actually this should sound familiar to all of us. And if you remember, when we talk about profit maximization, we have come across the concept of producer surplus, but for short run. uh, So it was the amount by which revenue above variable cost, or speaking differently, is the sum of profit and fixed cost. So would be like this, where we have Q on the horizontal axis and P on the other axis. And the short run supply curve of firm started like this, somewhere at one point. And this is the price, the minimum price where by which firms willing to produce something. And the short run supply curve is as MC, and assume the market prices at this point, and with that price firms producing at this Q star, market price P star, and this area above the minimum price that firms willing to produce and below the market price and above the short run supply curve is the producer surplus. That's what we learned. However, now we have seen that in the long run profit is zero, and all costs can be treated as variable costs. So there's no fixed cost. Then will there still be producer surplus? That's a dilemma, at least to us at this point. Because short run surplus was profit and fixed costs, now they're zero, so no more. Consequently, producer would be indifferent to any industry. That's what we're thinking about. The answer is yes, there still be producer surplus. But the question is who enjoying that surplus? That's what we will answer. One hint is if the input is scarce, like with the decreasing cost industry case that we looked at before, the suppliers of these scarce inputs may not be indifferent to the production status of the industry, because the new firms entering the market competing for these scarce inputs will make the input price increase. Remember that. So whoever owns these scarce input, they will be better. There is a formal definition for producer surplus. Let's check it out. Look at it for a second. Maybe some thoughts came to your mind already, but just go through it first. Producer surplus, or usually say PS, in the long run is the area above long run supply and below market price. So my first thought the first time I saw this was, hey, then actually just replacing the short run supply by long run supply. What's the difference then? But we talk about zero profit, zero fixed cost. Then what's the difference now? Or speaking differently, the extra return that producer make by selling at the market price above what they would earn if nothing was produce. Still, doesn't make a big difference from the short run case. No? Where the difference come from actually who would get that return. Huh? So now we're not talking about those producer of the output of the industry, no? Those who can manage to make profit or to sell at the price higher than their short-run average variable cost. We're not talking about the producer of the industry themselves, but the surplus is for whoever owns the productive inputs. So those are the one who gain some surplus now. Now, that could be the firm, the product producing firms themselves who own these scarce resource productive inputs, or it could also be someone who owns that but don't produce themselves but rent out this input. Now, so that is the case different now, which we will try to make clearer in the next slide. So if that is still blurry to you, and hopefully this example that David Ricardo gave would make it clearer. So Ricardo assumes that there are different blocks of land for agriculture production relevant to our field, and they differ in the productivity, how good they are for growing crops. So the first most fertile land, like the best land for growing crops, is used. So of course, they will be employed first in production. And once the production gets profitable, of course, new farms or new farmer or new firms, however you call, would like to enter this production and wish to increase output. Because of that, once all the fertile land, the best fertile land is used, then the next best land used, and so on, so on, so on, as number of farmers or number of farms increases. So that's the setup. And so in this case, we have something that we have seen before in the example, that the long run supplies positively slope, so upward sloping, due to this increasing cost associated with less fertile land. Wait a moment, why less fertile land is more costly? Because probably it's more work. It needs more resource in order to convert this bad land into something growable. So, for example, you have to have more fertilizer and then also more work to plow these plots. Okay, so presumably the average cost will increase once we use this worse and worse land. And depends on the quality of land that farm owns, it may earn a Ricardian rent or positive profit. Of course, because for more fertile land, cost is less, so it's cheaper, it's easier, and it's more profitable to produce crops on this land. So they may earn profits. This profit, however, different from the case we said before with firms entering the market then it will clear out the economic profit until and set the profit back to zero. This is not that profit we're talking about there. No. So this is the return to the scarce resource, and it's specifically in this example, the high quality land. Let's look at it on the graph. This is a graph that's familiar to us, at least I hope, about consumer surplus. It's a simple graph that we must have seen also in our introductory microeconomic course. So this color area below the market price and above the point where firms produce nothing up to the equilibrium quantity, this triangle is known as producer surplus. That's actually above the supply curve. Now, where does it come from in the long run situation with Ricardian rent? Now, so this is for the low cost firm where they earn quite a lot of profit by this blue area now, where the MC equals P, where they determine the output quantity above the AC. No? So they have quite a lot of profit over here. Or it could also come from a medium cost firm, or like the second best fertile land, like in Ricardo's example. No? The profit is a little bit, but still MC equal P and above AC at this output quantity. The third case is for the marginal firm or marginal farmer who barely earns something from producing because the marginal cost cross the average cost curve exactly at the minimum point of AC. Now. And now if you sum up this blue area, the rent earned by these firms across all firms in the industry, you will get to this blue triangle at the panel D of the market. That is the long run producer surplus. As we're living in a rational world with perfectly competitive market, anything promised to give you more profit or more economic interest later, of course, will be demanded more by some sort of market, and similar for fertile land or productive input in general. So those will be sold at higher price compared to the less fertile land. I hope there's no objection about that. No? So the reason is the moment they determine the price for the land they want to sell, they already take into account all the possible profits could be earned from the land. And that's incorporated in the price that they bid on the market already. And because when you buy the land for farming, for example, that's one capital investment of you. Doesn't matter what is included there. At the end, it's just an amount of capital investment. So the future profits included in that capital investment is called capitalized. This is sadly the reason why support to agriculture production is mostly capitalized in the land price. Why is it sad? Because the farmer, the one who supposed to get these price support or direct payment support measures is not necessarily the one who would enjoy the support at the end if he or she doesn't own the land, but rather rented it from some landlord. No? So the owner of the land will be the one who ultimately get this rent. This was also the explanation for the zero profit condition in the market equilibrium of the agriculture product market itself, right? Because they pay higher for this productive input. And this is actually one thing that I have witnessed, or more precisely, I have listened to, because in the beginning, when I arrived in Germany for the master program Africa, I lived in a farm, which is about 30 kilometers from here, from Bonn. So it took me on average 2 hours per way from the farm up to the university. And you could imagine, for hourly bus connection, if you miss one bus in the morning, you miss microeconomic class entirely. So sitting at home and watching the video right now may not be the only bad situation you're facing with learning. Okay, that's off track. Anyhow, I stay there for free food and accommodation. In exchange, I worked a few days per week, apart from the time I went to the university for the master. And the farmer was very kind, later became my adopted family in Germany. And by that, during the conversation during these years, I've heard from him that because he rented the farmland for his farming business, he did not own the land. So because he received some direct payment from the CAP, the Common Agriculture Policy of the EU, and because of that, his landlord had already increased the rent that he wanted from renting out the farmland to my adopted father. So at the end, he didn't get much out of this support, and that is something happens for real. You remember I mentioned price control at some point when we started. Now we will look at the welfare effect of that situation. So here's the setup. Our story began again with the first episode, the initial equilibrium episode, where you have point E, where both the short-run supply and the long-run supply cross the market demand. So it's both long-run and short-run equilibrium. And at this equilibrium price P1, the industry supply Q1 output. The next episode, demand shift. There's no surprise to you anymore, I guess. And because in this episode, there's no new firms entering the market yet, so supply responds just by moving along the current short-run supply curve up to the point where it meets the new demand curve, the prime. And at this new short-run equilibrium, the new short-run equilibrium price P2 prevails. That's the second episode. And then there comes the adjusting episodes where new firms entering, and then they increase the industry output up to the level where typical firm or no profit anymore, getting to the new long-run equilibrium. Now, implicitly, we also know that this is the point where the short-run supply curve has shifted to this point already, but we don't need it for now. So this is what we have to know. And from looking at the shape of the long-run supply curve here, we could already see that there's actually an increasing cost case, right? Because the long-run supply curve is upward sloping. So therefore, the new long-run equilibrium price P3 is still higher than P1 but lower than P2. That's what we know. However, what happens if it's not that case, that the market can freely adjust just by demand and supply force? In specific here, price kept at P1, no possibility to increase either to P2 or P3. No. So we will compare the consumer and producer surplus in these two cases. The very first thing to notice now is that when price keep at this P1 level, but demand have shifted already, then the demanded quantity is not Q1 or Q3 anymore, but Q4. Because this is where the new demand curve is. All right. So that is important. The welfare change or the welfare effect of this price controls include two parts. The first part is a welfare transfer from the producer to consumer, which is the dark blue area on the slide. I first go through it and then we could go back to explain why. Now, try to make it clearer to you. This is transfer from producer to consumer because now producers suffered low price why they deserved, or if they had been in the new equilibrium, the price will be free, right? So they selling with higher price, but now lower. Why, on the other side, consumer enjoy lower price than it should have been. So that's a welfare transfer. The second part with this light blue is the loss for both consumer and producer because of the quantity that have not been traded on the market. Okay, now let's go back and see what should have been at the equilibrium E-prime. Here I rewrote the E-prime again, just easier to talk about later. So now if that had been at the equilibrium without price control, then the whole part here from P3 to E prime back along the long run supply curve until here. This part is producer surplus. Now, by definition, the area above the long run supply curve and below the market price, which was supposed to be P3 without price control. Now, however, now with the price control, they only sell at Q1 and P1. No? So their producer surplus is only this part. So welfare loss or like producer surplus loss is P3, E prime, E, P1. Now, let's change the color and do something. Highlighter. So this part is the welfare loss for producer. So producer surplus loss. Now, let's look at the consumer surplus. Change the pen again. And this color. Okay. So before the consumer surplus, if that had been in this equilibrium, is the whole area here, right? By definition, the area below the demand curve and above the price. So it's whole big area here until somewhere where demand cross the vertical axis. Okay, this is the whole area. However, now with the price control, the quantity of goods available on the markets as Q1 only. No? So because of that, the welfare for the consumer or the consumer surplus loss this area. The area that I'm shading right now, that is welfare loss for the consumer. You have to use your memory a bit now. That's the welfare loss for consumer. Let's say this point is A, then, and this point is B, sorry. CS loss. A, B, no. Let's say it's here. Okay, so I go back to this slide without shading, hopefully to show you clearer. Or maybe not. Let's try at least now. So in order to see clearly what's the consumer surplus and producer surplus loss due to the price control, we first need to see what would have been there if the E prime happened at all. So at that equilibrium, by definition of producer surplus, that will be the whole area here. The area above the long-run supply and below the market price. And the market price in equilibrium case was P3, like we said. So that was supposed to be the producer surplus, this triangle in blue that I have. However, because of the price control, now price stopped at P1, and quantity stopped at Q1. So the welfare loss for the producer in that case, he does not enjoy this area anymore. The area that I'm crossing right now, right? He lost this area. So that is loss in producer surplus, PS, which is the area P3, E prime, E, P1. Now, that is one thing. Now let's move to the consumer surplus, but let's first properly change the color so easier to see. By definition, consumer surplus is the entire area that I'm shading that is above the market price, and below the demand curve. So it should be somewhere up there when the demand curve, the new demand curve cross the vertical axis, okay? However, because of the price control, now quantity stop at Q1 and price is at P1 only. So this part, I changed the highlighter again. This okay. So this, let me call this A for example, and then highlight it. Is for sure a loss in consumer surplus, because there's now no Q3 but only Q1. All right, so let's write it down again. Loss in consumer surplus A, and let's call this B, E prime. However, consumer also gain something over there. Why? Because they supposed to pay at P3, but now they only pay at P1. So they must gain something over there for the quantity that they're able to buy, which is Q1. It's actually for the entire Q1 and a different price from P1 to P3. Highlighter, and then let's change to this color. Okay. So this difference is what now the consumer will enjoy, right? For those who would be able to buy something from that Q1. And if you remember, but let me write it down. Gain in consumer surplus, which is P3, P1, E, B. So this area, the rectangle that I just colored in purple, is exactly what is said previously, the transfer from producer to consumer, because it was, remember, it was included in this area of P3, E prime, E P1. So that was part of the thing the producer lost, which is now becomes the gain of the consumer, right? And on the other hand, the two other loss area from consumer and producer surplus is now gone, could not be realized anymore. So that's the welfare effect of the price control. I hope that's helpful. Okay. On slide 30 of the material, it said that sum of consumer surplus and producer surplus is maximized at the market equilibrium. I mean, even though when looking at the graph, we already see that already now. When the market price at E equilibrium, so the above triangle, which is given by this triangle, above market price and below the demand curve is the consumer surplus. Now, and below market price and above supply curve is the producer surplus. So at E, only when the market equilibrium E, this area, like these two areas together is the largest. So graphically, we know that the sum of the surplus is largest there. And on the other hand, if it's somewhere at Q1, then we have a loss at F, E, G. That's what's said on the slide. I show you mathematically the proof that is indeed the case. So, for example, different color. Let U as a function of Q be the monetary measure of utility. Now go back to utility, meaning consumer willingness to pay. For a quantity Q. So that's the utility that consumer receive from buying Q units of the good. Okay? Then the consumer surplus will be defined by this UQ. What gets the utility, the measure in monetary term, minus what he has to pay for that, right? So what he has to pay for Q unit is P times Q, right? That's consumer surplus. Now similar, we also can have P as a function of Q is the long run supply. Curve of firms. So do you still remember what is the long run supply curve? It's the MC. So at equilibrium, the long run supply would be MC equals AC. Equilibrium. Then we have producer surplus is the revenue that the producer received minus this, the cost, right? The cost of the supplies. So what producer receives, also the revenue is P times Q, right? Minus, now what is the cost of this? Because we said PQ equals MC, and remember I have explained to you once that if you take integral from 0 until that point Q across that of this function, of this marginal cost function, which is PQ now, integral with the respect to Q, then you get the total cost of producing this Q unit. So that's what's happening here. Then we have CS plus PS, the sum of the two surplus is now, change the color so it's easier to trace now. So U, the utility minus PQ plus PQ minus this integral from 0 to Q of the marginal cost curve with respect to Q. And then we could cancel out. So CS plus PS would be, this is gone, right? Q minus the integral of the marginal cost curve. Then the first order condition for maximizing FOC for max CS plus PS would be the derivative of S, the first derivative. Here we're talking about the derivative with respect to Q now. So here we have function of Q minus, so the derivative of this integral is the function inside that integral itself. Again, we had talked about it, but for now, if you don't want to go back there, just accept it like that. Now, equals 0 for the first order condition. Meaning, the marginal utility of this Q must be equal to the marginal cost of Q, and that is at long run equilibrium. So this is the proof why it's maximized at that point, at this point. So what does it say? It says that actually the marginal utility from the consumer side must be equal to the marginal cost of producer from the other side, in order for the sum of the surplus, this area, to be maximized. And this occurred at the long run equilibrium, as we have known, because the demand curve, far in the past we mentioned that, is actually the curve that measures the marginal utility of consumer. So therefore, this situation happens when the market's equilibrium at E. Okay, last slide of macroeconomics. You're almost there now. So here I explained to you about the dead weight loss of tax on slide 32. So we have set up like a tax collected by the government, and this tax made the price that consumer pays higher than the market equilibrium price. On the other hand, make the price that producer receives less than that P stars now. And the difference between PD and PS here is exactly the amount of tax per product. Okay, so what we know more or less from introductory macroeconomics is that tax revenue is this T times Q2 stars, right? Because now the consumption or the demand or the supply is only Q2 star, not Q stars anymore, right? So times Q2 star, and if you substitute tax by PD and PS, we would have PD minus PS times Q2 star, right? And that is transfer from whom? consumer and producer to government. Sorry, I just realized that it may not be the best idea with my sweater, so I try to stay far away from there. Writing in right. So this is tax revenue. Yeah. And because originally this upper part, upper half of the rectangle is from the consumer surplus and the below part is from producer surplus. And now this part got transferred to government. However, this part, this is from the consumer surplus, and this part from the producer surplus is not compensated by any revenue from anyone. So that is the dead weight loss. Now, DW equals FEG, right? So now let's do some mathematical tools. So our objective here is we would convert the dead weight loss in some forms of elasticity in order to see some insight behind economically. That the first thing we should know is from comparative statistics. Adapters, after watching me doing this, some of you might have decided like never ever wanted to see comparative statistics again, but unfortunately it's helpful in some cases, and especially for this case, for tax incidents. However, at this point of the semester, I don't want to torture you with a lot of math anymore, so I will just give you the result here. And you know what's comparative statistics already, so whoever interested can do it on yourself and then come to me if you're stuck. So the comparative statistics for the tax burden give the result that the elasticity of EP times the elasticity of SP, outprice elasticity of demand and supply times each other, over the elasticity of supply minus the outprice elasticity of demand. Then here we're talking about market elasticity, time Q star over B star. And let's call this equation 1. This is the result of comparative statistics for tax. How output supply change, or how equilibrium quantity changes with respect per unit of tax, per unit of currency. So if we do it like the graph I draw here, which means we treated the demand and supply curves as linear, then this dead weight loss is actually the triangles. Okay? And let's start with that for simplification. So linear, not actually good approximation of demand. and supply. Why we have to have this linear approximation? So that we could calculate the area, the dead weight loss area as triangle. That's the idea now. So dW, dead weight loss, would be the formula for the area. So 1/2 with this bottom line, FG. FG is PD minus PS, right? So this here. All right. Times the height. The height is here. What is that? It is Q star minus Q2 star. So this is the first step. Now we write what is that? It is tax, right? Okay. Now because we wanted to have elasticity and we want to make use of this result from comparative statistics, we want to have dq star over dt inside there. It actually can be written by realizing that, the difference between Q star and Q2 stars is the quantity change caused by this tax incident, right? So the quantity change is delta Q, and you could write it as dt, so meaning how many units of Q is reduced or is changed per unit of tax. So let's say the tax is 3 euro, the quantity is 6 units less, then dq over dt is, so okay, dq is 6, dt is 3, then dq stars, like the change in q per euro of tax, equals 6 over 3 equals 2. No? So that's the idea. Times t. So now if you times t back here, you get 6. So delta q equals 6 again. So that's this part here. And because we're talking about the area, we wanted to interpret the dead weight loss as an area. Better write it as a positive amount, because it's area, just for that reason. And because we know that dq over dt, this very likely, almost always negative. So that's why we have to put a minus sign over there, so to make the whole thing a meaningful area. Only for that reason. In case you don't like it, because we're talking about a loss, we need negative thing there. That's also fine to me. Okay, let's simplify that. So minus 1 over 2 times t square dq square over dt. And then now we can substitute 1 into 2. Sorry. Into, we will get dw equals minus 0.5 t square, bracket all price elasticity of demand times overall elasticity of supply divided by all price elasticity of supply minus overall elasticity of demand. Now, times Q star over P star. We almost there. Now, the next step is to multiply by E star over P star, just to make it meaningful for us to interpret later. So that is 0 minus 0.5 T squared. This rewrite EDP times ESP, ESP minus EDP, the whole thing in the bracket, over B star. Because here we have one B star, time one B star is B star where. So we could actually write it as B star T over B star square. Now, then we have one P star on the numerator times Q star. Now, so B star times Q star. That's what we get at the end. And thanks to this thing, now in practice they could use directly this equation, assuming that everything was correct now, to analyze the dead weight loss of the tax. However, we're learning. We take this chance to understand why it comes to this equation before somewhere in the future you may encounter it and wondering what is the case. Okay? So here there are a few things important to remember. So that the T over P star square is the thing inside is the tax rate, right? How many percent of the tax over price, so tax rate. So you could see that the dead weight loss is proportional to the square of this tax rate. What does it mean? That means the marginal excess burden. Marginal excess burden. The whole thing here. No. Marginal excess burden of tax increase very quickly with the tax rate because it's to the power of 2, right? What is marginal excess burden of tax? That is just the change in the dead weight loss per dollar or euro or unit of currency of the extra tax revenue that the government receives. It's called marginal excess burden. So the more tax revenue government receives, the even much more, marginal excess burden of tax occur via the dead weight loss. That's the first thing. The second thing is the dead weight loss is proportional to spending on a good. So the more the spending, the expenditure, or the size of the market, let's say, because here we talk about a Q of the whole market, right? So the larger the market is, the worse the dead weight loss is when we impose a tax, right? And the last thing is the lower the elasticity, then the lower the dead weight loss. Now, why? Because if of this dq over dt, or q minus q star minus q2 stars here in the calculation of the dead weight loss. So then when the elasticity is small, meaning there's no quantity adjustment at all. So this is zero. There's no change in quantity, meaning the dead weight loss is zero. That's either extreme case. And from that you can see further, the lower the elasticity, the less the dead weight loss gonna be. That's it for the markets part and also for the end of microeconomics. It was quite heavy this week. I have to admit that I miscalculated the workload. It was somewhat a lot to do. However, at least from what I see, the fortunate thing is it affects me more than you guys. Okay, so good luck with this final step, and good luck with exam preparation. It was a pleasure. Bye.